I'm Walter Rose, and I'm a board-certified family physician from Indianola. I grew up in Augusta, Georgia. My dad was a doctor, died when he was about 45 and I was 5 years old. We grew up in the Depression. I was born in 1932, so we grew up in the Depression. And Mother never married again. I had a brother and a sister, older sister, and then a younger brother. And I went to public school and then went to junior college. But at the end of junior college, that was the end. There wasn't any finances, there wasn't any school loans, there wasn't really any scholarships for going to college or anything like that at that time. But interestingly, I had a teacher left in the middle of the year, and one that they hired was from Ole Miss. And I don't know, I was talking with him one day. I was his lab assistant, and we were just talking about what I was going to do, and I told him I'd come to the end of the road. There wasn't any place, Mama couldn't afford to send me to college and so forth. So I was ready to go to work for Lily Tulip Cup Company, where I'd worked a couple of summers. And he said, well, Ole Miss is developing a program in regional scholarships where they're trying to reach out to bring people here from other states to help them in their application for Phi Beta Kappa. So I managed to apply and get one of those regional scholarships, and that's how I ended up at Ole Miss, where I met my wife, and we married in 1953. And I was lucky enough to finish there with a master's degree. But again, the door closed. I wasn't able to go to medical school. My dad had been a doctor. My granddad had been a doctor. But I couldn't. Back then, you had to furnish evidence that you could pay, that you had finances in order to get through medical school, because they didn't want to invest. The state didn't want to invest in you. Particularly true in Georgia. And we went back and taught there. My wife and I taught on sort of like the kids do today out of school. We went to depressed areas in Georgia and taught for a few years. And then I got an offer to come here at Moorhead, and we were home visiting. One had come home for sort of a weekend, and Dr. Horton, who was president of Mississippi, heard that I was there and that I'd been offered a job at a junior college in Augusta. I don't know how he heard about it or whether my in-laws were involved in it, but anyway, he called me and asked me if I wouldn't come over and consider being on the faculty here in Mississippi. And we made a decision to do that and came over here, and Dr. Thigpen and I were the whole science department in the high school and junior college. But Mississippi had a program for rural doctors that if they would agree to go back to a rural area and serve a period of time, they would help them with their tuition and with their books. And so I applied for medical school here and got accepted on the rural scholars program, I guess you would call it. And so that's how I ended up when I got out of medical school. In order to fulfill my obligation, they had switched me over to a public health scholarship. And so I came here as Sunflower County Health Officer. And that's sort of how I got to Indianola. I had the great privilege of working with Marie Hemphill and helping her with, that's where I got interested a little bit in the history of medicine and so forth in Indianola. I was able to help her put that chapter together and find some things about the doctors in the different towns and so forth. And she told me then that I ought to write some of these things down, because one of these days somebody else might need them. But she was very, as we went through the things about medicine and so forth. The Mississippi Delta, I mean, the history of medicine in Mississippi started in the late 1800s with the Medical Association being organized and so forth. But the Delta was a hard place to practice. Even though there were more millionaires in Mississippi than any other state in the Union, at the beginning of the Civil War, most of that was done on the river. It was close to Natchez and so forth, where all the cotton farming and everything that went on. And we had, so in order to get into the swamps, because that's all it was swamps, and it was full of malaria and yellow fever, and was a very harsh time, not only on the people that were here developing it and clearing the land, but on the doctors who had to call. All they had were horses and mules in order to make their calls. We were still a good way away from automobiles and so forth for them to get around on. And it was hard. The average doctor maybe lasted 30 years. And some of the great doctors were right here in Indianola and Sunflower County that we know of. But in the late 1799 or so is when Mississippi became a territory and eventually a state, as you know. It was something sort of humorous about some of the things. We had a big outbreak of smallpox in 1884. And it was so bad that the people from Vicksburg actually went down the railroad track and tore up the railroad track so that the train could not come to Vicksburg to bring the disease. We didn't understand about transmission of diseases a lot. Even as early as the 1800s, we had problems. The water basically was polluted. And we had the mosquitoes everywhere. And it really wasn't until the age of DDT that eradicated all the Aedes mosquitoes out of the area. And we haven't had any malaria or yellow fever in the United States since then. But that was around the world. Now, that was not just in the United States. But it hadn't eradicated it in the rest of the world, but it did in the United States, interestingly enough. The people who had their plantations here often sent their families out of the Delta. They sent them to the hills every summer because of the malaria and yellow fever and polio. This was very prone to polio. I thought I would tell you a little bit about some of how medicine has sort of progressed as far as whatever actually happened to the Delta as we cleared it, and with the water, sanitation, and things of that sort. But I wrote down, just jogged a few things from Marie's book about some of the treatments that were used here at that time. Quinine and sassafras tea, and put yourself out in the rain if you had the flu. Now think about that. It was 500 million people got the Spanish flu in 1918. 50 million people died of Spanish flu, and we're sticking them out in the rain to cool them off a little bit. They used migraine headaches. You put a belt around the head and use fried pork and eggs on them. It was not uncommon even when I got here in the 60s to see somebody with a string around their wrist with a couple of coins on it. You know, that's, of course, progressed to copper now and so forth in use, but been used for arthritis for years. Treatment for a cold was a teaspoon of kerosene and molasses, and that seemed to help a little bit. If you were bleeding, a cut yourself, a dirt dauber nest, a spider web, some soot. Even when I was a young kid, that's what they used to stop it. If you were stung by a wasp or a hornet and so forth, somebody spit tobacco juice on you. And you probably remember that. And most everybody had an aspidity bag around the neck to drive off the evil spirits and mouthy odors that they had. But the Delta people began to pay attention to the Delta after the flood of 1927. That was probably the biggest impact that we ever had on the Delta. When the levee broke in April, there was still 3 feet of water at Yazoo City in October. We just don't realize that. And where the land had been cleared, the farmers, the plantation people, they had gone from slavery before the Civil War now to where there was sharecropper here in the Delta. And every about 40 acres had a house, a shallow water pump in the front yard, and a privy in the backyard. And this was all up and down the exposed areas where they had cleared. With the 27 flood, with the flooding that went on and the water filled up the privies and the water, all the bacteria and stuff floated out, this was a very hectic place to live. We had, even when I came here in the 60s, we were still seeing typhoid fever, paratyphoid fever, amoeba, all type of intestinal things that were in the ground contaminated the water. And so it was a pretty big thing. But with that flood came attention to Mississippi, not only in the building of the levees, but the Rockefeller Foundation set up a public health training school here in Indianola, right now where the old right across from the clinic where the old health department used to be. And they brought public health people here from all over the world, from India, South America, and so forth, and trained them in the diagnosis and treatment of infectious diseases and what was necessary as far as clean water and sanitation and so forth was concerned. And they stayed here about 3 years and brought in 35 public health officers from around the world here to Indianola. That's just how bad it was, so to speak. There were no hospitals and so forth in this area except for Greenwood and Greenville. But in 1935, there began to be a movement that we needed a hospital locally here. Most people were against it because they felt like you could just go 25 miles in either direction and you'd have a hospital. But back in 1896, up in Virginia, there was a Sunday school class of ladies who decided they needed to do something for the unfortunate people who had medical problems. They needed clinics, they needed medicine, they needed history. And they organized themselves as the King's Daughters, meaning that they were daughters of the King, Jesus. And they started the King's Daughters movement, and they had clinics, and then eventually they built a hospital, and eventually the program spread around the United States where you had King's Daughters groups that sprang up everywhere. And one of them was in Indianola, except instead of calling it King's Daughters, they called it King's Daughters and Men, which was interesting. And the leading man on that was Dr. Swartz at the old People's Bank. And but there was the Greshams, there were just a lot of people that were involved in that. But finally, in 1939, with the help of the King's Daughters Foundation that they laid, they got a 25% grant on a $25,000 facility. Now, it's interesting, the other 75% was people in town and around the county signed a bill promising the money, but that they could use this if they ever got into the hospital. In other words, if they donated $100, then they had a little piece of paper that showed them if when they got into the hospital and had a hospital bill, that would take care of $100 of it. But they raised 75% of the money for the hospital, and the hospital finally was completed in 1939 as a King's Daughters Hospital. And it remained King's Daughters through that. In 1939, the old hospital was so crowded, and they just didn't have enough room. They decided they needed a new hospital. And so they went across the street there and built what we know now as the South Sunflower County Hospital, but by then was still the King's Daughters Hospital. And a fairly large facility. And that's how the hospital sort of got started. In 1950s, Hill-Burton was a bill in the Senate that came out that made a loan to people to build hospitals. And the first one to take advantage of that in Sunflower County was in Rouville. The Rouville Hospital was built as a Hill-Burton hospital. And then our upgrade and so forth was Hill-Burton. And so we were known as a Hill-Burton hospital then for several years. And then things began to develop, and as we added East Wing and South Wing, and by 1968 we finally I say basically we're starting to get it desegregated. The time of segregation was here when I got here in 1963. I came here as a Sunflower County health officer and was here several years before I joined Hull Brothers Clinic. And but this was a big thing. Back then, it's hard for us to realize how segregation affected even the medicine. There weren't any black nurses or black aides or anything else in the hospital. We had a separate nursery for black and a separate nursery for white. They had a separate ambulance service, so if you were involved in an automobile wreck between blacks and whites, the black funeral home would come out and pick up one side but wouldn't pick up the other, and vice versa. And it was a time that, I mean, nobody really paid much attention to it. We finally got a nice dining room, but it was interesting that we began to hire nurses. Nurse Walker was the first RN that we had here at the hospital, and was joined a few years later by three girls in the LPN program, which was Doris Weems and Lavinia Lee, and we began to make some progress. As things went on, we had an unusual chairman of the board named George Light, and I was lucky enough to be here, chief of staff, when George came on board, and he had just this interesting way of putting things to our administrator, Miss Reno, who was, of course, following along in the footsteps of her predecessors with the hospital. And I remember him saying to Ruth, do you think those babies in the nursery really are conscious of the fact that they're black or white? say, what do you think about that? And she'd think about it a little while, and the next thing you know, the nursery would be integrated. And then the same thing with the cafeteria. It was just, you think, you know, and goodness, Ruth, don't you think we need an ambulance service or something? I mean, the way the situation is going between blacks and whites and these wrecks and everything, don't you think we need an ambulance service to sort of? And so that's sort of how we started. And he began to just change very slowly concept here. When I first came here, we had a ward for where the blacks were on the other end, and all the rooms were semi-private that we had. And we, Rubel made they were a jump ahead of us. They had all private rooms, and which made a big difference to some of the patients and so forth. And so, but gradually all of that changed, and then one of our last overhauls was when we went to individual rooms in the hospital and did away with that, and of course did our nurseries, and everything began to come around, and I think it was just all because of the personality and relationship the Lord, George Life had, that changed all this without anybody knowing it. Lavinia Lee and some of the other girls in the hospital thought it was that they are the ones that made the changes, but they did talk to the hospital administrator about different things and complain, but whenever they did, George would just slip in there and change it at the board meeting. You know, he was the one that was doing all that. There was some interesting things that happened back in the early times here in Indianola, and it was a landmark thing. I would guess 55% or 60% of the babies in Sunflower County were delivered by midwives, and the other percentage maybe home deliveries. There wasn't a whole lot of people delivered in hospitals in the early years. But we had a midwife here named Matthews, and she called the doctor one day and said she had an unusual circumstances down there and she needed a little help, and wondered if he could come and help her. She had delivered Siamese twins vaginally. Now, how anybody ever got Siamese twins out vaginally, we do not know. But she delivered. These were Reverend Matthews' daughters, Linda and Lillian Matthews. And they got them out and took them to Memphis to a Dr. Wilson, and he separated them. And they both now have families, have grandchildren, I guess, their own by now. But that was a real interesting thing. A couple of other things in there that I thought was really interesting, and of course that was in 1946 was when they first came out with DDT, and DDT was around for a while. In 1961, Rachel Carson wrote a book called The Silent Spring, and she talked about the effects of DDT and what it was doing in the food chain as far as birds were concerned, and why the eagles, ospreys, hawks, and so forth were becoming endangered was because the DDT in the food chain, starting with the plankton, the minnows, the little small fish, the big fish, and finally you got to the top feeders, and they had all that accumulation of DDT that was washing off of the fields and so forth after they sprayed them. And would cause them to have soft eggs that wouldn't hatch. And so she kept on with her, and she did. 10 years later, they passed a law in the United States and banned DDT, and then eventually banned it in the world. Although I think I've still, some folks here in Sunflower County still got a couple of barrels of it around, I think. I'm pretty sure. One of the things that that really began to make a difference in the health of Sunflower County, because when I got here, and even when Dr. Pritchett got here after me, we still spent a good bit of our time on contagious diseases that we had. We finally got a sewage lagoon in 1964. We were the first city our size to have one, and it's still here. It's functioning, it's still functioning for where all of our waste goes through to clear before it dumps into the Sunflower County River, which made a big change in what was going on in Indianola. And then eventually they began to put sewage lagoons in Sunflower and Moorhead and Drew and so forth to take care of that. And then our water became a real priority as we began to, it was still in the 70s before we were able to get the water fluorinated, chlorinated, and begin to have rural water systems to tie in with everybody. And as we got away from the shallow wells and the contamination that went with that, because all the water levels were contaminated. Now, obviously the artesian wells weren't where we drew our water from here, but they were in other parts of the county and were a big problem. I thought we had some interesting things that happened. We became all private at the hospital in 1968. That's when everything was through with and we had done that. But in 1971, we had a tornado here in Inverness that hit, which was dramatic, I think, as far as the history of the hospital is concerned. That night, we saw 350 some odd people came through the emergency room. Miss Pritchett was the first lady that came through with a fractured tibia. I remember that. But it was interesting the way that thing developed, and it became sort of the guide for the rest of the disaster. You know, all hospitals now prepare for disasters, and just like the one in Las Vegas recently. But it was interesting how that worked. They called in all the doctors, they called in all the hospital personnel when it hit. And we had never practiced for a crisis. We had never had any type of practice or anything, but it was just amazing as the doctors came in and took their places. People from cafeteria began to bring food and drinks. The people from housekeeping began to go get tags to tag people with when they came through the door. And we just developed a disaster plan as we went. And by about 5 o'clock, 5:30 the next morning, I remember Dr. Hurt and I were just sitting in surgery there exhausted, but Dr. Arnold had been at surgery all night, Dr. Pritchett, everybody, all the doctors, Dr. Hurt and all of us were there. And we thought about, we'd seen 350 people. We had guided them through there. We'd gotten, doctors had come from other communities to help us. Dr. Walter Jones came from surgery residency in Jackson to help operate on people. Dr. Stacy Davison in Austin came from Cleveland, and Lewis Grocery Company was very instrumental in helping us because the roads were so clogged up from the tornadoes, the highways. We had to go either around, but they were able to fly these people to Jackson. And we did lose some people in the tornado, obviously. A Pepper family over in Moorhead. And, we had some double amputees. We had several cases of tetanus that died from the tornado. It sort of made other folks realize they had to have a disaster plan. And we were very fortunate to be there when all that went along. In 1975, we had a big outbreak of St. Louis encephalitis that produced what now is we have West Nile now, but back then it was St. Louis encephalitis that produced the sleeping sickness and so forth that we had. Finally, in about 1977, we were able to pay off our loan to Hill Burton and became the South Sunflower County Hospital that we know of today. The 1979, we had the first birthing center here in the state of Mississippi with Dr. Pritchett and his wife were running the birthing center that we had here. It was extremely nice a time when they came here. It was also an interesting time. Excuse me. The Carter administration, they had passed a bill to bring nurse practitioners out in rural areas between the big cities, like out west where you're 300 miles between cities and so forth. So they passed this bill for the nurse practitioners to sort of be in the middle where they could help and send them on sort of first aid and so forth, and sort of the clinic. And the first clinic that was set up in the United States was set up in Inverness, Mississippi. And with Joanne Whitworth, who was a nurse practitioner at the time. I don't know, I guess with the help of Eastland and so forth, Senator Eastland, they found it didn't have specific mileage on it, and so our rural health clinic sort of started back then in 1979, I think it was. It was interesting, in 1982, Time magazine recognized the South Sunflower County Hospital as having the first CAT scan for a hospital its size. There was but our biggest success, I guess, was in 1988 when we partnered up with a Dr. Red Duke out of Texas Tech University in Waco and Lubbock. He was an emergency room physician. He was a tall, sort of red-headed fellow with a big mustache. Anyway, we sponsored first hospital to sponsor a TV program that dealt with medicine and medical care. And our problem was that people would love it. I mean, they loved it, they saw it, and finally it just got so expensive we had to discontinue it after about 5 years. But the patients would come into the emergency room looking for Dr. Red Duke, or they'd come to the clinic, and I'd say, well, the closest thing we got is Dr. Pritchett. You just send them on to Dr. Pritchett. So they thought they kept calling him Red. And we came up with George Light came up with an interesting thing, a small hospital with big potentials. It's what that was the reason we got into that TV advertising. I was thinking 1993, Indianola Academy here was the first public or private school in the United States to do drug screening on people who were not the kids who were not participating in extracurricular activities, were participating in extracurricular activities. Now, they didn't bother those who did not, but for those who were participating. And of course, we got calls from 60 Minutes and everywhere else about that. But it was an interesting thing. It's still going on. It's financed by Delta Weston here. And it's not punitive at all. If they find a positive test, they repeat it immediately. If it's still positive, then they arrange for them to go off for have treatment and so forth. So it's a very positive program. Some of the interesting things that happened, though, early on when I was with the health department and with the medical here was that we still had, in the 60s when I got here in 63, we still had voodoo and that type of problem going on in the Delta. And they had what we call conjure women. When you drove by their house out in the country, you would see these blue bottles lined up in a blue bottle tree at their house. And that meant they were capable of casting hexes or taking off hexes. And one of my first experiences that I had here is Dr. Joe had a patient who was actually hexed and was literally dying. His weight was down to about 88 pounds. And Joe and Arnold they called me in just to watch it. I was just coming in to the practice and so forth. But Dr. Hurt and I, we were all in there. And Dr. Arnold gave this guy trilene gas, which was a gas that we used to use in obstetrics for just temporary sleeplessness and so forth. And then woke him up, and he sent his son John and Toad and so forth down, and they had caught a bullfrog down on the bayou and woke him up and said, "Look, this is what we got out of your stomach. And you're now dehexed." Right there, he asked for something to eat and drink. Dr. Marie talks about it in her book as well. It was something to behold, though. But it was not uncommon sometimes. We'd have to send folks down to the psychiatric department at the university to be dehexed, who was a pretty big thing back then. Piker, or eating of dirt, was also very prominent back then. And they got that red clay. If you read any of William Faulkner's books and so forth, you know that they got the clay. He gave permission to dig up the clay up that Roanoke. And the people that left the Delta and went to Chicago and places like that, it was a big business shipping them clay. They ate the clay. Apparently they had some type of mineral deficiencies and it caused them to do that. But it was called piker, and we still rarely see it today, but it's almost unknown. And a lot of the women who ironed developed piker from tasting the starch all the time as they starch the clothes. And we have seen patients in the emergency room who looked like they were at term delivery and they were just full of clay. Which is another thing that we've seen. So there were some interesting things that happened along back there. We didn't really know a whole lot about all the doctors that came through. The doctors were hired by the farmers to look after their labor. And so where you may have had a few prominent people like Dr. Campbell and Dr. Irvid and Dr. Newell and Dr. Phillips and all those around the county, you had a lot of doctors that came here as a plantation doctor. They didn't use the hospital. They didn't apply for medical staff privileges and so forth. But they, back then, payment came harvest time. And if you had a crop failure, you didn't get paid. So the doctor then would move on to some other farm, just like a lot of the sharecroppers would when they wouldn't get paid. They'd move over to somebody else's place. And so the doctors moved in and out of the farms here without staying. You know, there were always some in Drew and Rouville, other parts of the county as well, but we had a lot of people that came in and out. As soon as the interesting things that happened, I thought at the hospital immediately when it opened, twins were delivered. The first twins were Celeste Reed and her sister from Inverness, delivered at the hospital. And we had two doctors, brothers, who asked for if they could have delivery privileges at the hospital. One was from Marigold and one was from Belzona. This was Toxie Hall and his brother Wesley Hall. And they had two people that needed cesarean sections, and they didn't want to send them to Greenville or Greenwood, so they decided to do it themselves. And back then, they used spinal anesthesia to deliver patients. And those first 2 patients that had spinals in the hospital died. It's just how dangerous it was back then to do that. But anyway, Wesley went on to become president of the American Medical Association, moved to Reno, Nevada. Dr. Toxie Hall, of course, had a successful practice in Belzona for years and adopted, I don't know, 8 or 10 children. Very, very likable man. But those are some of my most memories, I guess, of my hospital stay here in Indianola. It's really been a blessing to me to be part of the hospital staff and to have been able to see a lot of the changes that went on in the hospital and where we are today. We talked about funeral homes just a little bit. There were no funeral homes, basically, in the early part of medicine. The first funeral embalming took place after the Civil War, when they sent in the bodies of the officers and so forth back east. And they, what they did was put them on a bed of charcoal and then load ice on top of them to preserve them and send them back home on a train. As you wonder, in biblical times and even now around the world, if somebody dies, they're in the ground that night, usually, just like they did Jesus was the same way. But they still do that. When we go to Honduras, medical teams, you have a death, the person will be in the ground by nightfall. They just have no embalming way. In the early days here, the funeral homes were furniture stores. And Pete Rogers and them had the Indianola furniture and so forth up there. They handled the coffins, and you went into the furniture store and bought your own coffin to put the patient in, and then buried them out. Either buried them at the church or either buried them, out on your personal property and so forth. It was, but they used to handle everything, and funeral homes came in sort of late, but they used to have an interesting thing called a cooling board, and the funeral home would go to the home and embalm them on this cooling board, and then the family would sit up with them, until time to go for the burial. In England and even in this country sometimes they had a thing called a bell ringer. And that was in case of people, they had a bell up on top of after they buried the person, there was a little device with a bell on it. It's with a string that went all the way down into the coffin, so that if you sat there and if the bell rang, it meant that the patient had woken up and they was wanting to get out. And they were called bell ringer. That's how you got the thing, a bell ringer. But that was a slow the embalming process and so forth that took place, and I thought was really interesting. Well, I think the obesity problem began as we began to go for the quick fix on the highway. When the golden arches came and the other fast foods, people slowly began to quit cooking and would run out there, and with pizza and so forth, as all those came in, nothing wrong with that. That's just the way our diet shifted as people love the fried chicken and the breads and so forth, and so it started, I would say probably in the 70s is when we first, and it was at the same time that all that was going on was when we began to see the high blood pressure, the cardiovascular disease. When I came here in '63, we were just trying to understand cholesterol. And we used to accept a 300 value in cholesterol as normal. and you didn't even think about trying to change your diet until, at that value. We just didn't understand about cholesterol and good cholesterol and bad cholesterol and so forth. But the obesity problem started, and then TV, the combination of the two, where they didn't go outside, you just stayed in and didn't go outside and exercise, and it's just become a gradually problem. But not only here in the Delta, but in everywhere else in the country, I think we have a problem with that. It's just so easy to get a pizza than it is to cook up some greens and other meals. So I think that's probably where that came from. But the obesity problem is not getting better. To me, it looks like it's getting worse. And I think it's because more and more we are depending on the fast food industry, where the calories are, and lack of exercise. 1982, Jim Woods, who was our business manager at the hospital, at the clinic, asked me if I would be willing to go for a mission trip for a week. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to go for a week. I've thought about mission field, but that was a commitment of 3 months to 6 months or a year. And here he's talking about a week mission trip. But anyway, he and I signed up along with Jimmy Gage Dobbs, who was teaching here at the time from Calhoun City. And we hooked on to a mission team that went to Honduras in 1982. There were only about 15 of us on that team, but that was the first time, I guess, that I really realized the value of spreading the gospel and our responsibility to do that. We had two things that happened on that trip. Lofton Davison, fellow Gideon with me, furnished us with about 24 Spanish New Testaments to take with us. So we decided, we could only give them to people that made a profession of faith. Well, where we went was a little village called Las Troas. They'd never seen a doctor, never seen a dentist, never seen a pharmacist, never seen a prescription. They were born Catholics, but had never heard anything about the gospel. And, to see them for the first time be exposed to the gospel was something. We had very little response. We had a lot of interest, but we didn't have a lot of response. And anyway, I gave this guy a New Testament who had made a profession of faith. And he didn't move for a minute and then started tearing it into pieces. And he tore it into the book of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and so forth, and gave it out to different people that were there in his church. That was something. Of course, we've gone back with Bibles and so forth ever since. And we went with New Testaments first. After the first year, they wanted the whole Bible because they didn't know about Abraham and Noah and all of that that's in the New Testament. So, and the other thing that really, I guess, locked us in, we were closing up. It was our last night in the village. It was on the border between Nicaragua and Honduras, and this lady came walking in on a cane in her 80s. She'd been walking, she said, for about 8 hours. She walked in and just walked in where we had a little fire going into the firelight there, and we had to get interpreters right quick. We couldn't understand what she was saying, and she said, "Tell me about this man called Jesus." And we did. Of course, we got the preachers to help us, and they explained the gospel to her and everything. We gave her a Bible, and she wouldn't accept any medicine. She wouldn't accept anything else. She turned around and walked back into Nicaragua. And I guess those two things, we've been going back ever since. We have now started building churches, trying to do something permanent. The medical, dental, eyeglass ministry, everything else is temporary. You know, if you worm a patient down there, they'll be full of worms again in 30 days. So you have because the area we go in is a mountainous area of eastern Honduras, and a lot of dirt floors, animals in and out with the kids and so forth. So it's very prone for parasitic diseases. But we decided we had to do something permanent. In fact, Scott Poindexter and Milton Earl Jeffcoat came to us. We had built a church for the little village in Las Troyes, and they came to us and said, you know, we got to start doing something permanent. We can't be coming and doing medical, dental type things. We need to do something permanent. So that's when we started our church ministry. We've been able to finish now 26 churches, and plus the Bibles that you leave them, plus the gospel that you try to leave them with. And so we try to leave that permanent part, knowing that everything else, our shoe ministry, our food ministry, all of that is temporary. But we wanted to give them something for eternity, if we could. Give them a place to worship. So that's what we're doing now, still after this time. I think of, you know, Paul was preaching at Las Troyes. He was on the third floor of the building, and fella went to sleep and fell out and landed and died, and Paul had to go down and bring him back to life. But he was on his way back to Jerusalem. We were up in a little village one night, and you would guess it would be Leslie Fletcher who was sitting up in the window. He fell asleep and fell out. And of course, down there things are still pretty, water and sanitation and so forth. It's still a big area, but one of the funniest things to me, although it was not funny to him too much, he gets on his nerves when I tell the story, was that I had Bobby Webb from here he was a medic in the Navy, and he was down there checking blood pressures for me. And he was sort of standing here, and he was checking this lady's blood pressure. And just out of the corner of the eye, I noticed that her arm was getting red and then blue, and Bobby was still blowing up the blood pressure cuff. And I looked down at him, and this lady had started breastfeeding right in front of him, and he had his eyes on something else besides the blood pressure. But anyway, so we sort of got away with Bobby about that. But it's always humorous. Leslie Fletcher of course, was our man that kept us relaxed and always stirring up things and so forth to keep, you know, seeing the mass of people. We see 1,000 folks a day in the medical area in Honduras, and what you see, you know, and you can't do anything about, you know, it can be very depressing. And it was always Leslie's job to keep us uplifted and, you know, telling jokes or carrying on something with somebody. One night when we first time he went to Las Troyes, he practiced up on his Spanish. Now, the time we went to Las Troyes was between the war between Nicaragua and Honduras. Now, I didn't tell you that there was a war going on, and we went right down through the middle of it. I don't know, we just trusted the Lord. As long as we were on the Lord's business, He's going to look after us, but we went. Anyway, Leslie started practicing on his Spanish, so he goes out, and we got a soldier there with a AK-33 or whatever it was, and sort of watching us we had gunfire going on up there, and he walks up to the guy and tells him he loves him. And needless to say, he started chasing Leslie, chased him all the way back into the compound. But that's just the kind of things that Leslie did. The other thing he did one time, which was interesting, we got to coming on back home. As far as I know, he's the only person that's ever been able to get on an airplane without a boarding pass. But we got up to San Salvador, and he lost his boarding pass. And of course, that panics everybody. We're all panicky about Leslie not having a boarding pass. And finally, we have to make a decision to go on and leave him there. So we decided we would go on. Look, after 5 minutes of Leslie Fletcher talking to them folks in El Salvador, they put him on the plane without a boarding pass. That's just what Leslie could do. But those are some of the humorous things you remember. There were many of them. And they, on purpose, I mean, they're purposeful things that people do. Children's ministries and all of that, and our ministry. Well, it's gone from, it's preventative now. I mean, everything now is pushing toward the prevention things, and which makes it extremely difficult. Doctors are keyed and trained to treat diseases and things of that sort, and it's totally computerized industry with the idea that everything now is trying to be preventive, and rather than having the disease, it's trying to catch it first. And that's the biggest change going on in medicine today. And of course, anywhere the government's got any say-so in the payment of things, you've got all the regulations that have to go with that. And so those are the things that make so many people leave medicine, is just having to, is all industries, whether it's the banking industry, farming industry, or whatever it is, has all these regulations that you have to go through now. And sometimes it's just too much for the doctors or farmers or somebody else, and they want to rent the farm rather than, you know. The problem with malpractice suits, and we had a lot of them, and don't get me wrong, when they, there was a time when we had tort reform, and it was going to start on January the 1st. And I think we had 25 lawsuits filed against us in the month of December by lawyers trying to get on the docket in Sunflower County. Now, the reason they were suing us in Sunflower County on these drugs like Vioxx and Fen-Phen and so forth was that we'd had a $12 million verdict here in a jury. Patient in a nursing home had a broken hip, and they hadn't discovered it for a while. And anyway, they brought the case over here to get it out of Washington County, and they gave them a $12 million verdict. And so every trial lawyer was trying to get all these cases covered in Sunflower County, but we had two big cases, one 10 million, one 12 million, that most people have not anything about, but that really changed the face of medicine. The problem was doctors really couldn't afford much over $1 million in coverage. And so if you got into a lawsuit and it was $5 million, then the insurance company just wrote you a check for $1 million and said, good luck. And so that's when I mean, the doctors began to, the malpractice really began to be a big problem. And and that's when, but now the hospitals, the reason so many doctors now working for hospitals is for the malpractice. You can't be sued but for $500,000 if you're working for a public institution in Mississippi. And so that's why so many doctors now have moved to under the umbrella of a hospital, is just to get rid of the exposure that you had before. Now, there's still a few that don't do that, but the majority of the doctors now are working for hospitals.
It offers some protection, right?
Well, it just protects you from that threat of that you can't I mean, when we dealt with those 25 lawsuits in a month, and that means you have to respond. You got to have hire a lawyer to respond to that complaint, even though it all washed out eventually. You had all that pressure of that, and of course, all of us who've done obstetrics have been sued because, you know, if something's wrong with the baby, it's got to be the doctor's fault. I mean, that's just nothing wrong with that thinking. That's just the way it is, and so that all of us have had suits against us, and most of them we've successfully defended, but some of them we haven't. And that's true of all medicine. Somebody is challenging your ability to diagnose and to treat somebody, and I guess the first thing you know is shock, and then you can't think of anything else. The problem is it interferes with your practice and everything as you're trying to think if it really is if it's going to court. You're just going through everything in your mind and trying to get all the information you can. I mean, it's just something that bothers you all the time. I think that's what they're talking about when they talk about that. It's just something that happens to us. It's just part of it, and we don't like it, but it's going to happen. It doesn't matter. Emergency room physicians particularly get sued just because they don't have a rapport with the family. And it used to be that they would rarely sue a family doctor. But now, as the lawsuits became bigger and bigger, I mean, I've had people look right at me and tell me, you know, I'm not suing you, doctor, I'm suing the insurance company. You know, this has nothing to do with you, it's all the insurance company. That's what their lawyers tell them to tell us, and but it does happen, you know. But emergency room just don't have time to, and the idea that you grew up and you might be in your next door neighbor or whatever in your neighborhood or something, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get sued over something. Amazing. The silver-tongued doctor we had, Dr. Pritchett here, he was always fun to give depositions with because he could answer just about any question they ever asked. You know, he was we call him the silver-tongued doctor. When they got to the lawyers, they did not intimidate him at all, which was amazing. I mean, the rest of us were like sheep, you know, just in front of the trial lawyers. But Lanny could hold his own. Sad. The opioid thing is, in a way, they're correct. Because Mississippi started a year and a half ago trying to curtail all opioids, particularly in the class of oxycodone and Percocet and so forth. But you have some people with legitimate pain that you can't help with the non-steroids and things of that sort. So those are the losers in this fight on opioids. What is happening, the overdoses are really not related to more or less the pills as much as they are a drug called fentanyl. It is it comes in a patch. And what they started doing was taking the patch apart and pulling the ingredients up. It's for 72 hours. It's supposed to be a 72-hour patch, and they pull it all up into a syringe and inject it all at one time. And so that's how they're overdosing. It's mainly on fentanyl. But what's happened is the government has clamped down on opioids. The heroin folks moved in and have a drug that is cheaper than pills, than the opioids. And so the young people are going more to heroin. And now it's into fentanyl. But we have more problems here with heroin addicts than we do with the opioids now, seriously. But it doesn't mean that you have a lot of folks in this county, I would say, that have a lot of legitimate arthritis and spine problems and things of that sort. But they're not on any opioids now. And the state is moving. I think they're probably going to pass a bill that you cannot prescribe over 15 pills or a week's supply of a pain medicine for a week, and that's all you can get. And if the pharmacist does it, he's liable if he refills it or whatever. You know, it's so they're really trying to cut down on the opioids, but the problem is, as I see it, is the heroin and the fentanyl that's coming up in its place. There is a type of fentanyl that they use on elephants that will put down an elephant, and they're injecting that now. So I mean, we are in an epidemic of opioid abuse, but it's predominantly in the oxycodone, fentanyl class that has. Most folks can take a Tylenol number 3, you know, and it's hard. If you take too many of those, you're gonna get constipated and can't have some side effects from them. So, but most people. But that's where we are with this opioid thing, and it is sad when you have an overdose, and when you have somebody die from the pills. And this new bill that they passed to furnish Narcan to all the EMTs, which is what you can give them to reverse the effects, so that when they get to a call, they've got something in hand that they can use to reverse it right then. Maybe make a difference and get them to the hospital. I mean, you just can't restrict opioids and think you're not going to cure the problem. They're going to find relief in alcohol, or they're going to find relief in something else. If I had to do it all over again, I'd start again. You know, I would not hesitate if God is calling you into medicine. That's where you ought to go, and not be worried about all the changes that are going on. They're going to change. That's just the way life is. The medicine's going to change. We've come a long way from turpentine and aspidity. I guess it was God's providence that brought me here, and the way that He brought me. And I guess all of us can look back on our life afterward and see maybe God's hand in dealing with things and sending you where He wants you to be. But it was a wonderful 54 years that I had anyway in practice. Enjoyed every minute of it, and I miss it. Okay.
Will you let me be